Good morning, everyone. Welcome to The Broad Perspective here on the Broad Perspective Network. We're glad you're with us today. My name is Vivian Komori.
And I'm Katie Curley Nelson.
And we're going to be joined after our first commercial break by a gentleman with the name of Josef Dolezal. And he's going to be talking to us about the Upanishads.
It's going to be very interesting.
And Western mysticism. Yeah. I've just been doing some research on this subject, and I've been learning quite a bit because, honestly, I'd heard the word and had no clue, really what it was. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, we're going to find out.
Yeah, we're going to learn quite a bit, I am sure. And, Katie and I both like learning things, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is a subject I love, so that'll be great.
See, and you're so much more versed in this than I am, so, yeah, I'll just kind of sit back and listen to you. Yeah,
from what I understand, just
a
scholar.
Very knowledgeable young man. He's already on the road to doing great and wondrous things, I do believe. So we're going to have fun visiting with him. He's a great guy, too.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so do we have any announcements or anything, Katie? I don't think we do we?
I don't think coming up right away.
Everybody's just getting ready for the holidays.
Still recovering from turkey.
Yeah, that's true. And we hope everybody had
a
great holiday.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were talking before we came on the air about what we were going to do on our Broaden Your Horizon segment.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we draw cards that kind of stimulate our brains, and we can figure out what we want to talk about. Today we came in because we had some experiences and some purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to talk a little bit, what was it, about fear?
Fear.
Yeah.
Maybe not just fear, but also delusion.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one.
So, and maybe the combination of the two and how they interact with one another.
Right. And one of the things that Katie and I have been talking a lot, if you listen to this show regularly, is we've been talking a lot about knowing who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my contention anyway, and I think that Katie is in agreement with this, that most people don't know who they are. They think they do.
Mm-hmm.
And they define themselves by all the externals and what they have and what they've accomplished. And the reality is that's really not who they are at all. And people don't really give it that much thought. They don't really go into that introspection to find out why they react certain ways, why they behave in certain ways,
mm-hmm.
and what's the root cause of who they are. That tells you a lot about who you are.
I think sometimes you have a certain perception of yourself.
Right.
Or a perception of what others think of you.
Yes.
And that perception is not always reality.
No, it's not. We've got the iceberg, and that's 15% above the water.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got that underneath the iceberg, which is 85% of that ice is underneath the surface. And that's who our consciousness is that 85% that's under the surface
mm-hmm.
that even we ourselves don't know. And I know that there are lots of scholars who have devoted their entire lives to knowing who they are. Saint Ignatius, I know, is one of them.
Okay.
Has really devoted his life to understanding the depths of who he was. For instance, and one of the examples Katie and I in our conversation had talked about, say for instance, you're super jealous. Your husband's flirting with another gal,
mm-hmm.
and you're really jealous. Well, it's obvious you're jealous, but why?
Where's that
jealousy coming from?
Mm-hmm.
What's underneath the surface
mm-hmm.
of that? Why are you experiencing that emotion? Because there's something underneath.
There's a root cause.
Mm-hmm. And that's what most people don't stop and think about. They're going to blame that person for something. They're going to say,
blame the person they're flirting with or whoever.
Exactly.
It's always externally they're blaming. They're not turning it on themselves and looking internally at what the real issue is.
Right. And last week Katie and I talked about maturity.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And this just plays right into that because that is really a huge level of maturity. Mm-hmm. Maturity is really about that intrinsic knowledge of knowing who you are.
And that in turn affects how you react to that situation.
Exactly. So when you're faced with something, you may or may not react differently. However, when you can acknowledge why you've reacted
mm-hmm.
that way and who you are that behaves in that way, that's huge. That's a huge manifestation of maturity.
Now, how does someone go about knowing their self?
It takes time to pause and reflect. One of the things that also in our conversation earlier, I was mentioning, I was at a meeting today and I heard someone say, well, they have to be real careful and guard what they let into their minds because it affects their being. And so because they want to always be positive, they want to always think positive and always keep that mental attitude. And I vehemently disagree with that. Because if you cannot observe, no matter what it is, anything, and be okay with whatever it is, then you are not being real with who you are. Because you should be able to deal with anything and maintain balance with who you are.
That's not easy.
No, it's not. No, it's not. But that is paying attention. Like, say, if I watch the news tonight, there are things on there that might disturb me, but do they change my vibration?
Okay, that's good.
That's the main thing. Do any of these things change your vibration? And if they do, then your vibration isn't where you think it is.
Or that vulnerability to whatever it is that you're viewing, maybe you need to look closer in depth on that.
Right.
Where, like, if you're watching movies or watching, whatever, documentaries on something, and there's a certain theme, like, let's say, every time you see the father-daughter thing, then that theme, it gets to you. Well, there's a reason. Is there an issue between you and your father, or that relationship? So certain, triggers that you can see. If you can see that certain pattern of certain triggers, then that's one time you should really turn inside and say, okay, maybe there's some unresolved issues here that I have that I need to focus on.
Exactly. That's what helps you understand who you are. If these things are disturbing you, you don't want that disturbance, but you also need to pay attention to why. It's because you're uncomfortable. Maybe you feel uncertain that you have any power over it. Maybe that bothers you. Maybe you think you need power to control world hunger. I don't know. But there is a reason for everything, and your primary vibration, truly, your primary vibration in a perfect world should be able to be a part of everything and yet not be a part of anything.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
And so that's when it gets really deep. That's when it gets very, very deep. And as you watch people and their behaviors, I'm of the so judgmental opinion that most people are not aware of who they are, and
I think you're right on that.
And how they behave. They're just not really aware because it's not in sync. So we all have lots to learn in the process, myself included. That's right. Otherwise I wouldn't be here.
No, and we're all learning. And that's the thing is, if you are open enough to try and learn and be aware of the triggers and be aware of the patterns that you see in your life and be able to focus on them and work on them, that's a step. That's a step in the right direction. If you're delusional and you live in this fantasy world where you're not even going to recognize it's always somebody else's fault, it's always somebody else's issue, you're never, ever, ever going to know yourself, ever.
Right. And you're not going to be any different, any better, any worse.
You can learn to play the game, and people do, and they pretend all day long. But the truth is in there, and the truth is within you.
Right.
And you're the only one that can turn around and find it.
And that's the key to everything.
Right there.
So we'll ask Joseph when we talk to him in just a few minutes to expound on that, because I think he's going to have some insights on that.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know what the Upanishads speak to as far as our subject matter, but my guess is they probably have a lot to say.
I would think so. They wouldn't have lasted this long if they didn't,
that's
right?
That's very true, exactly. Because I think that's the repetitive theme throughout all mankind's history. Know thyself was written above the doorway at the Temple of Delphi back in ancient Greece. That's been, knowing who you are has been a key factor in everything. And so we keep aspiring to things that make sense in some ways, and then again, when we look at the key and core issues, we really still aren't getting it. And in my oh so humble opinion, it is time for us to wake up to the fact that we don't know who we are. We think we do, and we don't.
I think there's a lot of purposeful distractions, though.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Purposeful, well said, yeah.
I think there's distractions that keep us from maybe wanting to, or, I mean, it's easy to just sit in front of the TV and veg out and not really think about those things. There's times to relax, and there's times to do that. But I think it's important that we take a little bit of time to do a little bit of inward
reflection.
There you go.
Yeah. You're right. So it's time. So that's our challenge to our listeners today. Take some time, do some inward reflection, and see what you can find out about yourself. I've had to do that in the last few years. I've spent some, oh my gosh, some really, I'm going to say painful times too, to take a look inside.
Do you ever stop though? I mean,
no,
I
we
think
never
it's
do.
an
I think that's
ongoing
part of our
process.
process, but it does make us a different person. And I'd like to think a better person, but that's subjective too. So it's all good. So we're going to be back in just a few minutes. Stay tuned, and we'll be visiting with Joe Dolezal. And we're looking forward to this, the Upanishads and Western mysticism. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Do you ever wake up and ask yourself what's really going on in the world you live in? It's time for you to be aware. It's the #1 alternative website on the planet. TruthIsScary.com. Daily stories. Log on daily to get the latest information on the stories that radio and TV wouldn't dare to cover. Experience our curriculum with over 20 topics, from government conspiracies and extraterrestrials to meditation and nutrition. Celebrity interviews. Watch exclusive videos with your favorite celebrities and find out what their alternative views are. It's your source for the information you won't find in the mainstream media. It's TruthIsScary.com. Log on today and be aware. TruthIsScary.com.
Welcome back to The Broad Perspective here on the Broad Perspective Network. I'm Vivian Komori.
And I'm Katie Curley Nelson.
And we are getting ready to visit with Joe Dolezal. And he is going to be talking to us about the Upanishads. I hope I said that right, Joe.
Upanishads, close enough.
Upanishads. I'm getting your name down, Pat, and then I'm struggling with that word. And we're also going to talk about Western mysticism. And Joe, we're so glad you're with us today, because this is a subject that I've heard the word over time, even though I still don't know how to pronounce it well. I have heard it. I just don't know that much about it. And I've been doing my homework, and I've learned a lot, and I find it quite fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to our chat, because I think this information is going to be quite valuable. How in the world did you ever just take an interest in this?
Well, it's actually kind of a long story. I initially started as a math and physics major when I was still in my late teens, and the book that inspired me was actually Brian Greene's The Elegant Universe. That's kind of, believe it or not, what inspired me into this whole, I guess, occult mysticism, supernatural psychic field. And because I at the time, of course, I didn't know much about anything, so I just naturally assumed that the sciences had the answer to everything. So later on, to my dismay, unfortunately, I realized that it doesn't, or at least it's not publicly disclosed. So I started veering a little bit more towards, I guess, what we can dub as the esoteric or spiritual dynamic of humanity. My first dabbling into it was many years ago, when I actually read a book that I randomly came across called Thought Power by a Swami Shivananda, and essentially that was really the gateway book that led me into all these dynamic spiritual concepts like Kundalini Yoga, like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, various spiritual and religious experiences. And one thing led to another, and then before you knew it, I really got heavily involved in what we call the Upanishads. That's kind of what we're discussing today, but that's actually one of my most favorite subjects, and has been for many years now. And the Upanishads essentially are commentaries, if you will, on what are called the Rig Vedas. The Rig Vedas are essentially like the Eastern, I want to say Hindu, but that would be technically inappropriate to call it Hindu, more about its Brahmanic literature from the Brahmins, and it's like their Bible is what it is. It essentially talks about the creation of the universe, the creation of the human race, the dilemma of the human conflict, if you will, and it just goes, it's basically like the Bible of the East. It's probably the most oldest literature that at least is currently available on record. And the Upanishads are essentially mystical commentaries on the whole subject, and they can range anywhere from just dealing with psychological phenomenon from the phenomenon of perception, dealing with the body and whatnot, and also it goes very deep into the mystical aspects of things in terms of magic, meditation, reflection, contemplation, and really the whole gamut of the human experience. And it's truly fascinating literature.
I think it is. And from what I have deduced, and part of what you said too, these texts were written before the time of Christ, before the time of Buddha. Mm-hmm. And we had discussed before we came on the air about whether or not they existed before the Sumerian text or for any Egyptian hieroglyphics, the timeline mm-hmm. there. I find that all quite fascinating. I'd like for you to speak to that, and then I want to come back and talk about creation and the dilemma of humanity. So, first of all, the timeline. What have you discovered as far as the timeline goes?
In terms of the timeline, it's very interesting. It is even admitted today as even conservative estimates that the Rig Vedas have their root anywhere from 6, 7 to 8,000 years old. That's what's actually admitted today. Realistically, it's probably much older than that. I would speculate that it predates. It predates this human era, this human epic, if you will, meaning that I feel that the human race goes through cycles of 7,000 years where it essentially something might happen or they maybe kill each other off and then a few remain and then they start all over. It's a new process. And so I feel that the Rig Vedas predate this human epic era, which I think started around 4000 BC again.
So that's kind of when we started over. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
we started over into where we are now, and we'll come back to that timeline in just a little bit. So what do they say about creation? What is creation all about in the text? What do they reveal?
Well, it's essentially something. I guess it's pretty difficult to understand in terms of just spewing off a few sentences, because it's something that you truly have to read several times over, and you kind of have to meditate on it, because it becomes more of a intuitive abstraction of understanding rather than a psychological something you can articulate in words, and what's ironic is, when you get to the meaning of, the bottom line of each of these, even the Bible, even the Old Testament, it all talks about the same thing. In the beginning, there was one without a second, and then something happened where it split the two, and this certain bifurcation happened, which is essentially the initiation of our universe. And so in terms of the beginning, it's interesting because it doesn't really elaborate so much on a beginning as such. It does talk about, in the beginning there was just essentially a whole, and then things started bifurcating, started becoming dual in that perspective. Now, it wasn't so much a question of that was the absolute beginning and there was nothing before that, because it does even refer to parallel universes. It does refer to infinite universes, and so, for all we know, our universe could just be one of an infinite amount of universes. You've probably seen movies that were like that.
Right.
So in terms of the beginning of the Upanishads, it talks about essentially that we come as a human race from a very, very long timeline, that the human race actually stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, and in some cases millions of years. And according to, I don't know if you've ever heard of the yugas, right now we're currently in the Kali Yuga stage.
Yes.
And this is basically the most degenerate phase that the human race will experience in a very long time, that we were in point, in fact, gods at one point. We could levitate, we could meditate, we could, not meditate, but rather levitate, teleportation, any kind of teleportation, telekinesis, moving things with just the mind, thought stuff was all a very real possibility, even up until relatively recently, about 20,000 years ago. And because of the influence of the stars, then the human race can do nothing but really kind of go with it. And the result of that is really just a type of human degeneration. Now, it's not really all doom and gloom, because the objective is a type of purification. It's kind of the ebb and flow of the universe, and the end result is to actually purify the entire human race over an extremely vast time cycle. It doesn't happen in a couple hundred years, a couple thousand years. We're thinking more along the lines of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
So where are we at in that cycle now?
Right now we're in Kali Yuga, which according to the 26,000 or 25,450 cycle year, because that's actually what's even in Western mysticism considered the precession of the equinox, then we are actually bouncing back from the low point. The low point was supposed to be sometime in the 14th century. So out of that 25,000 year cycle, we're actually bouncing back up from that 25,000-year cycle. Now, within the 25,000-year cycles, there's even subsections of four units or quarters where they're actually broken down into 7,000-year cycles, which is exactly what I was talking about earlier, and even the Bible refers to it in terms of the 7,000-year cycles where we go through, and that's actually where we even get the 7 days of the week, because it's supposed to represent a completion of cycles. So right now, at this particular phase, this epic, we're actually in the 6,000th year, which is, ironic, because if your audience is attuned to biblical history, or what would have been considered as Orthodox biblical history, then they always say that the world started in around 4,000 BC plus or minus. Well, they're not talking about the physical world, obviously, because dinosaurs. They're talking about it's a mistranslation. They're referring to this specific age in the human development started around 4,000 BC, which would exactly correspond to the 7,000-year theory.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's that in Revelation, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. There's the 6,000 years, and then there's that remaining 1,000 that constitutes the 7,000 years.
Right.
And there's that. So are we heading into that 1,000?
Right.
Coming out of that 1,000?
I think we are. And this is just my personal opinion from what I know about how the banking laws work, because even legal common law and even banking law, the reason they're so successful is because, believe it or not, they actually abide by spiritual principles quite rigidly, and that's why they're so successful in what they are, despite the fact that people think they're doing very, immoral and corrupt things.
Right.
But, to not stretch out an extremely long discussion, I think that we're going to see probably maybe another 70 years of turmoil from 2001, and I think it's going to go about another 70 years. So sometime in the year 2070 is when it's going to pretty much climax at its very, very worst, and then after that it'll get much better. I'm not 100% sure that we'll actually see that 1,000-year reign, but it will come. I just don't, because of the way that the banking institutes they institute and implement certain debt crises on the people. It actually happens in 70-year cycles. I don't know how familiar you guys are with the subject, but not to diverge.
Somewhat, yes.
Yeah, not to diverge too much. Essentially, they were the United States corporation that was located in a country called America was actually established in 1860, 1864, I believe it was, and then 70 years forward we have 1933, which was the establishment of the Federal Reserve, and then fast forward 70 years we get basically the implementation of the Patriot Act, which nullifies a lot of the old Americas, which was a result of 9/11. So it's and even the Twin Towers was a very symbolic process of destroying the old ways of order, the duality of such, and creating a one world government. And that goes more into the Kabbalah and stuff like that. But, as sinister as these things are, they really do abide very strictly by spiritual principles, and that's why they're so successful. But
It's funny you would say that, because one of the things I've noticed, and in honesty, my whole life, I've never given much thought or value to the importance of contracts. But I am getting the opinion that that is an intention of all beings, earthly or otherwise, that there is something about contractual law.
Oh yeah. Well, contract law actually comes. Contract law is obviously it's emanation from common law, but all common law emanates from canon law, which is the spiritual law essentially.
Okay.
And the reason was for that is because I guess there was some kind of an agreement in the 16th, 17th century that spirituality was going to become, in certain respects, defunct. And rather than trying to imbue the human race with things they couldn't understand, like spirituality, because most people just don't care or they think it's superstition, then they just try to rationalize it via the intellect, which is really the basis of the intellectual renaissance that we had in the 16th, 17th century. And they just made everything more mind-based, which is the result of common law. But common law is part and parcel of canon law. It just doesn't have that spiritual dynamic behind it. It doesn't have the spiritual justification behind it, if you will. But absolutely, I mean, everything that you do, you know, when like right now, we basically established a contract by going on this radio station,
Right.
because, you know, might not have been written, but there's this tacit agreement that we're going to do something and we're going to execute something, and when you don't do it, then, you know, you essentially undermine your character, then people don't want to deal with you. But it also has something to do with the cosmos as such, because I think you're not fulfilling your karmic obligation that you made prior to coming into this body. That's my personal opinion.
I like what you're saying there, and I find it quite interesting. So, in other words, your word is your bond still does have huge credence and value.
Absolutely. And I mean, you can, you know, like I always say, it's easy to fool people, but it's impossible to fool God. So, you know, if you back down on deals, then eventually it'll reflect, and then people just won't intuitively want to deal with you, even if they don't know why, you know. So, I mean, you know, even the Holocaust. Did you guys know, like, for example, the Holocaust actually means a sacrificial burning? Did you know that?
No.
Yeah, that's what the word actually means, that sacrificial burning, because, you know, and that's another subject, but I'll just slightly touch up on it. There's a book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and it turns out that, you know, granted that there was like Henry Ford and IBM that were behind Adolf Hitler, the number one financiers of Adolf Hitler the entire time were actually Jewish Zionists on Wall Street.
Yes.
And the reason they wanted that, you know, people would say, well, why would Jews want to fund their own sacrifice? Well, that's exactly the point. Sacrifice is probably one of the most important spiritual principles that are known, you know. And I mean, the Bible is flooded with these kind of examples where, you know, they say sacrifice is the measure of credibility.
Wow.
If you want something, then sacrifice something which is extremely valuable to you, for the gods, as it were, and prove to God that what your intentions are and what your interests are truly have merit, and you're not just saying something for the sake of talking, and God will grant you that thing. Well, you know, what have Jews wanted for, you know, at least 2,000 years, you know,
Their own land.
Their own land, exactly. Yeah. And so it turns out that, you know, the word Holocaust, when you look it up in, you know, dictionary.com, and the word Holocaust means literally a sacrificial burning. You know, sacrifice as in sacrifice to the gods, and burning, you know, you see like Adolf or Schindler's List example, you know, where there's that prominent scene where, you know, the Jewish individual is walking down the street and then the ashes start falling down on him. It's kind of like Hollywood's telling you something, you know, you just have to learn to read between the lines. So it's, you know, and that's why I say, you know, these people that rule the world, they might be by all means corrupt, immoral, and psychotic from our perspective, and they are, but they do, I think, vehemently abide by spiritual principles, which is probably the number one reason they're so successful, because they understand how the laws work. I'm not talking about government law. I'm not talking about corporate law. I'm talking about God's law, about how spiritual contractual things work, you know, a tit for tat with the universe, if you will.
Now, how would you define these people that run what's going on?
I don't think I don't think they're government. I think they work through government. I think they implement the government, you know, kind of like the priesthood of the Illies things. They're essentially people behind the scenes. I don't even think it's the Pope, you know, like the Vatican is actually a corporation. I don't know if you guys know that. It's not.
Yes.
Yeah. And so with that said, it's like, you know, like even the Federal Reserve, Bernanke has nothing to do with the ownership of the money there. He's a manager. That's it. He's just a spokesman for the Federal Reserve. But who actually owns it? You know, even if we say, oh, okay, well, the Bank of America, Chase, you know, and we just start going down the Wahlbergs, whatnot. Well, that's fine, but who are those individuals? Nobody can really put a face with a name. I personally think it's the kings of Europe that basically went under in the 1900s. They created corporate bodies, and everything just became business, and it lost its spiritual touch. That's who I personally think it is. I think it's just very prominent kings.
That's who's controlling things right now?
In terms of the finances, yes. And I would say that they essentially use a type of black magic to control it. I honestly think it's black magic. I think it's very, very astute and a keen understanding of the electromagnetic life force. I think they understand sacrifice. I think they understand spiritual principle. I think they're even in communion, what we would quote unquote call the gods. You know, of course, there's many gods. There's not one god. And even it's interesting, you know, I looked at what the word queen means. And did you know what the word queen actually means, a prostitute to a king? Did you know that?
No.
I looked up the etymological dictionary, the etymological definition of a queen, because I always wondered to myself, you know, anybody who's done any substantial research, and I won't go into it too much now, knows that so much of this filth and degeneration comes out of England, you know, the British Empire. And I always thought to myself, well, could it really be that, you know, the queen, this, you know, 70, 80-year-old lady who's doing all these things? Because obviously, you know, it's not really power and greed and corruption really isn't concomitant with a woman's thought, and it really historically never has been. I mean, of course they have that dynamic, but that's always been kind of a man's thing. And so I thought to myself, and I'm like, well, what is a queen? Because we always see the queen, but where's the king? Nobody ever, we haven't seen the king since the 1902, I think it was, or maybe the 1950s.
Right.
And so, yeah, it turns out that, a queen by definition is actually the king's prostitute, somebody who stands in front of something which the king represents, which is funny. That's what the word queen actually means. I didn't know that. So I would say, that makes sense that the powers once again are behind, but nobody ever sees these powers. And, you would have somebody standing in place of the power, kind of like the Pope is the vicar of Christ, even though he's not Christ,
He would be the pimp then.
Essentially, right? Essentially. So,
well, on that, we're going to have to take a commercial break. Let's pick this up when we come back. We'll be back in just a minute with more of the Broad Perspective and our visit with Josef Dolezal. There.
It appears we may be living in turbulent times. Are you prepared? Find out. Go to www.72hours.com. That's www.72hours.com for more information on home safety, pet safety, water, resources, training, and community support. We can always hope for the best, but it's good to be prepared for the worst. Get involved, get ready, get informed. Go to www.72hours.com for more information.
This is brought to you by the Broad Perspective, a public service announcement. Welcome back to the Broad Perspective here on the Broad Perspective Network. I'm Vivian Komori.
And I'm Katie Curley Nelson.
And we are visiting with Josef Dolezal. Dolezal. Joe.
Right.
We're visiting with Joe.
Joe. That's better. Joe of the Pyramid Center. Just try that.
Joe of the Pyramid Center.
Pyramid
Center. I wanted to talk about that.
We do want to talk about that. We're going to do that on our last segment because that's phenomenal. What you're doing there is phenomenal. But let's go back to this information about the Queen and the King and all that. I just read an article this week about the Queen is a direct blood lineage to the Caesars in Rome.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that.
Right.
That this ruling elite has descended from, at least from that timeline, and I don't know what was prior to that, but there is definitely a correlation between Rome and the throne in England.
Right. Well, we definitely, in today's terms, our entire social structure is based 100% on what was of ancient Rome, and even in terms of the money. There was a saying that we essentially have we have Jewish law, we have a Roman form of government, and a Greek lifestyle. That's actually, Greek culture. That's kind of like where the three aspects of our modern culture come from. But the Roman obviously has the most prominent influence because even, everything is run through like the Vatican, essentially, where you have the Caesar. The Caesar at the time was essentially God on earth, which is what Pope is supposed to represent, the God on earth today in the Vatican. And these bloodlines that you're referring to, there's actually 12 of them specifically, which which correspond to the 12 tribes of Israel and then the 12 constellations. And ironically, if you look on the back of the dollar where you see the Jewish star, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. You see the 6-pointed hexagram, which is the two triangles interlaced. There's 12 stars on that, probably most likely representing the 12 families that run the world.
And is that related at all to like the Illuminati?
I think it is. The Illuminati is a very, very, very ambiguous, I guess if you want to call it a fraternity, because there's been a lot of speculation. Of course, David Icke talks about it, and of course, Jordan Maxwell talks about it, and there's a tremendous amount of people who speculate on it. But see, the entire concept of the Illuminati, the individual that made that concept public was an individual named Myron Fagan. He was a Jewish screenwriter in the 1960s, and he was about to pass away, and I believe it was 1967 where he actually came out with an LP record, which was just an audio recording, just him talking. He was about 2 years before he died. And I guess he had very prominent connections to these individuals, the Illuminati, because he just starts talking about everything, what their objective was, how they were going to do it, what they were going to do, how they were going to execute it, but he never said who. And he never really pointed his finger at it. He never even insinuated that he would either be a king or a pope, or if they were maybe just individuals behind the scene that worked within government. So the real and true nature of these individuals we call Illuminati is elusive. Nobody really knows who they are, even though some people will say it's the Bilderbergs, or or it's the Warburgs, or it's these Jewish Zionists, or it's members of the Vatican. The truth is nobody really knows. It's all speculation, which is entirely based off of Myron Fagan's Illuminati excerpt, which you can actually hear on YouTube. If you just Google search, or even YouTube search Myron Fagan Illuminati, you can listen to the whole 9-part series for free on YouTube. And that's really what every single person, big or small, today bases their rationale off what the Illuminati is. There was individuals like Albert Pike that made it public back in even 1870, but nobody really gave it any heed or attention. So, I mean, they do go very far back. That is true. They are very powerful. That is true. Who they are, if they're an elite part of the government, or if they work absolutely in secrecy where nobody even knows who they are, it's truly a mystery. And then the other question is also, even like individuals like Albert Pike refer to Julius Caesar as being an Illuminati. So, this concept of Illuminati could even far predate, the 1776 Adam Weishaupt revolution. So that in itself is a very technical subject, how far you want to get into it. And ultimately, like I said, at least nobody's ever been public with it, who they are. And they're not presidents. There are Freemasons who are presidents, and there's very powerful people and judges that are Freemasons, but Freemasonry itself, it's just, it's a caste type. It's like saying a president, okay, but you're a president of what, are you a president of Hungary, the United States? So if you're a Freemason, you're a Freemason of what? The Grand Lodge of England, the OTO, the Illuminati, So Freemasonry is just a general term. That doesn't mean you're a good or a bad person. That just means you're part of a fraternity. That's all that means. So that's, like I said, it's a pretty dynamic depth subject, but I don't know how much time you have. Maybe we should delve into the Upanishads instead.
Yeah, we should probably come back to that. But I do want to say that I do think that some of that's going to be revealed in our lifetime, or I should say my lifetime, because I'm quite a bit older than you are. And I just have that feeling that at least there is going to be some sort of revelation for some of us. And I know that there's a book being written right now by someone who is greatly in the know that we've interviewed, revealing some of the Illuminati members, and I'll disclose that at another time. But I've seen excerpts from the book. It's pretty profound. And so, anyway, I can only hope. I hope that I can live long enough to see something exciting. You can
always come back again, Viv.
Okay, right. But I'll forget. I can't remember anything now. Why would I remember it then? So, anyway, let's go back to the Upanishads. I want to call them the Oompa-Loompas, but the Upanishads. Well, what I want to know, what is their prognosis? What is their hope for humanity, or is there any hope for humanity?
Well, of course there is. There's always hope for humanity, and I don't even think the situation is honestly that bad. I mean, if you have a roof over your head and food in your mouth and gas in your car, then is it really that bad? I think one of the problems is that Americans in general, they've always had a problem where, because of the bankers, they've always issued out credit to debtors that essentially never had, they never really had enough, I guess, collateral or leverage to even pay off what they have. Because if I ask you for $100, and you're going to ask, well, what's the collateral you have, and just in case you default, and I say I have nothing, then you give me that $100. It's a risk you're taking that you won't ever get that money back. Without going into a vast amount of details, the one of the problems is that the bankers swelled this country up with so much pride and so much material wealth artificially, that the American people, for I would say at least 50 to 60 years at very least, have essentially, they've always gotten so much more than they put into the system. And that's one, and you could thank the bankers for that, for printing out money that had no value, because everybody was kind of living in this fantasy world. Well, what's happening now is they're kind of calling back a lot of those debts, and that's what really the bailout was. The bankers essentially wanted some of their money back, and it had something to do with the mortgage crisis and this and that, but they just wanted some of their money back. And and since they wanted the money back, then they got the money back because people were so angry. It's like, why am I losing my house and you're paying these people when they're the source of the problem? Well, yes and no. Again, when we go back to contract, there's always, it takes two to tango, and we have to be objective about who's really at fault here and why who's really at fault. Because the problem is that for at least 2 generations, the American people have had this almost this addictive fetish to taking things which they weren't entitled to, money, houses. And now since it's all being retracted back onto, then, most people are going through the roof because they don't know how to react to it. And now people are starting to realize that they have no material wealth, they have no leverage. Most people have very few to no skills in terms of producing for, an economy or for themselves, because most people can't really do much of anything. And so I think a lot of people are starting to freak out a little bit because it's like, uh-oh, well, those times are over, so what am I going to do now? You mean that, I don't have to just be able to pick up a phone and, I'm getting paid $15 an hour to be a telemarketer? No, it doesn't work anymore. Now you have to actually produce something valuable for society, and I think that's freaking a lot of people out. So, I personally don't think it's that bad. I just think people have to be realistic and understand what are they entitled to for what they can actually put out,
Well, I think you're right, Joe, but I also want to say something is that is true for us. We have it very nice. We have, most of us in this country have roofs over our head and food in our bellies, etc. But that is not the case for a great portion of the world's population. They go to bed hungry. They go to bed cold. They don't have any of the luxuries. So we have this Marie Antoinette let them eat cake syndrome. The reality is lots of people are suffering.
Right. And it is, and there are a tremendous amount of people suffering. In the United States, I would say it's a little bit different, and then it's a very skewed subject, because then when we go to like Africa, for example, then my philosophy is, had the European or maybe I would even specifically go back to England, had they not went there and tried to do their colonialization and just left the black people alone in their tribal state, they would have been much better off than going in there and devastating their old way of life and then not giving them anything, and now they're in extreme poverty. Well, of course, because you've totally ruined their culture, you've ruined their tradition, you've ruined their history, and and you give them bare necessities because you're hoping that they're going to submit to you due to economic deprivation. That's what they're hoping. That's how these things work. You go in there, you promise something better, you take what they've what's worked for them for hundreds and thousands of years, and then now 50 years later, after we've all forgotten what the actual root cause of the problem was, we're saying, oh, look at the Africans, we have it so much better. Well, yeah, but had white people just never went to Africa to begin with, then they would have been much better off than we are today. And nobody ever bothers to look at that a lot of the problems that we're having here today is it's not realizing what happened historically, and it's not realizing it really is. It honestly is a double-edged sword, Vivian. It's because, like I said, the government, I think, should be protecting the people. It should always have the interest of the people, but it hasn't. It's always had the interest of corporate commercialism. And so, really the government, in a lot of respects, is even more to blame than the corporations or even the Federal Reserve, for example, because they sold out the people. Not the Federal Reserve. They're just doing business, and they're not good. But they're the ones, the government is actually the ones that sold out the people in the interest of corporate business. And, and as a result, you fast forward, 2-3 generations where you get people used to just, virtual reality, Nintendo video games, TV, fast food, malls, conveniences, getting cars on loans with leverage and collateral that you don't have. Then what do you think is going to happen, And I think that's what the government should have came in and stopped it and said, listen, you're giving these people more than they deserve. What are you going to do when you blow the bubble? Well, the government just puts its hands up. The corporations are still taking more, and people are just looking confused like they don't know what the hell's going on. And that's really the plight of this whole situation. It's multifarious, it's just not one side. It's, like I say, I think it takes 2 to tango, and the people are just as responsible for it. Why weren't the people educating themselves? Why were you in nightclubs instead of reading a book and educating yourself about law, economy, economics, So, and that's what it comes down to, because if you're not going to govern yourself, then, that's like the old adage that somebody will do it for you.
Well, yeah, so. I think a lot of it's all fear, because people are afraid. They are afraid if they know this information, they have it, that they won't know what to do. They won't know how to act. It's like that one movie, You Can't Handle the Truth.
Right. And I think a lot of people can, because of the way they've been programmed beforehand. I've noticed, especially and that's kind of a double-edged sword again, is because, when you talk to when I talk to youth in terms of the teens and the 20s, then they have the ability to understand it, but because they don't have enough life experience yet to really appreciate what you're saying, it doesn't stick. Right. And then when you talk to people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, then I think for them to swallow what you're saying, it would be too painful to realize that you really don't own your home. It's actually illegal to own your home. You don't really own your car. You're basically going to slave your entire life away just to live, for the average person, that does the whole rat race and 9-to-5 thing. You're basically going to slave your entire life away just to have a mediocre existence. And, all your money's going to a queen that you don't really support and to a government you don't really support. And so rather than admit that, I think it's better just to deny it as a conspiracy for most people,
Yeah, and play the game.
I think you're right on, too, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is. But, again, we're going to come into some interesting times because as the economic situation will get categorically worse, people losing their homes, people getting homeless, then I think a lot of people will be like, hey, what the hell? Might as well look at this information, and it'll just awaken more people. So, there is, everything is a curse and a blessing at the same stroke. And, even though we're going through bad times, I guess materially right now, there's always that potential that people will start looking inward, spiritually and intellectually, and see what the hell's really going on. So it's just a matter of how you approach it. That's why, I said, I don't think we live in bad times. I think we live in good times. I think if you're used to getting things which weren't entitled to you to begin with, then yeah, we're living in bad times. But, if you just open your eyes a little bit and you have the will to want to learn, when we're in phenomenal times. Think of the internet. You're old enough to remember land before in the internet, and
sure.
Just think how much that revolutionized information. I mean, you could do things that just weren't possible 10, 20 years ago.
I'm old enough to remember 8-tracks.
Nice.
Yeah, I know. I'm really dating myself. We're getting that sign as time for a commercial. Okay. So we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how to contact you. I think we need to do about 10 hours, but
there's not nearly enough time.
We can do a part 2 if you guys want.
I think we're going to need to. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So stay tuned. We'll be back in just a minute with our visit with Joe Dolezal
of the Pyramid Center.
Of the Pyramid Center.
BPN. Join the awakening.
The Broad Perspective Network is a portal designed to reveal a new perspective and reality to those who wish to know the truth about the world we live in and our role in it.
BPN. See beyond the illusion.
Welcome back to The Broad Perspective here on the Broad Perspective Network. I'm Vivian Komori.
And I'm Katie Curley Nelson.
And we're visiting with Joe Dolezal of the Pyramid Center.
Nice.
And we do want to give some contact information before I forget, Joe. So folks that have questions, what would they do?
They could go to the website to check out what's going on with the Pyramid Center, which I'm guessing we'll delve into a little bit here at thepyramidcenter.org. That's thepyramidcenter.org. And you could reach me directly if you'd like at Joe, at thepyramidcenter.org. That's Joe, Joe at thepyramidcenter.org.
Okay, cool. Now, tell us what the Pyramid Center is all about. I've seen pictures. It's like going to be so awesome.
Nice. So what it essentially is amongst, I guess, during the times of studying, what I was studying all these years, then I came to the conclusion that I think what would need to happen for people is, there's that theoretical aspect, which of course we all deal with, but then there's that spiritual aspect that one kind of needs to be in a position, physically in a position where they can extricate themselves, at least for a brief moment, from the whole matrix, the paradigm of what's going on right now in the world, and better themselves and kind of reflect in on themselves spiritually. And so I've had this idea for a very long time. I've been very fortunate to actually get a gift, a donation, if you will, from an old lady that's now passed away, and she gave me this property over here in the San Bernardino Mountains, which for some of your listeners, I don't know how far or wide they are, but San Bernardino is essentially in Southern California, right next to Los Angeles. And I got about 237 acres up there.
Oh, wow.
It's a pretty big parcel, and it's smack dab out in the middle of nowhere, which is perfect. It's about 100 miles from Los Angeles, east of Los Angeles, and it's absolutely surrounded by national forestry, so you're literally in the middle of nowhere. And what I wanted to recreate was essentially a type of ancient Alexandria, where it was a type of spiritual, intellectual nexus where people can come to go and meditate, to reflect on themselves, read books if they want to be just left alone, if they want to go in there in groups and do certain types of chakra healing or sound healing or experiment in any kind of alternative healing therapy, whether it be physical, mental, or spiritual, then that's the place you would go and do it. And I actually did, for your listeners, if they kind of want to get a little bit more on that, I did a video. If you go on YouTube, it's called the Pyramid Center promo video. If you just YouTube search that phrase, the Pyramid Center promo video, then you'll see I just did actually like a 10-11 minute segment with some friends on that stuff. That a guy actually came down from Canada, and we filmed that together. Just kind of, it gives you the who, what, when, why of the center, you know.
Yeah, I can. I've seen that. I've seen that video, and it's beautiful. It's stunning, and your vision is equally as stunning. I'm very excited about what it is and what you're doing. I think it'll be phenomenal. Can't wait.
You actually putting a pyramid in there?
Yeah. There'll actually be a pyramid on top of the apex of one of the mountains that we have there. There'll be a 50 by 50 base and a 30-foot high pyramid there. And, you know, one of the major problems I'm having right now, it's, you know, I put a lot of money into it already, but I'm having issues trying to get water up there. You know, I try to drill for water, and, you know, it didn't work out for whatever number of reasons. And so I'm really, really struggling to get water up there. But other than that, you know, I've already developed a prototype bungalow. I already have a 1 kilowatt system hooked up there, and we got roads and hiking trails and all that stuff. So even for the more adventurous type, you could definitely go up there now and camp out and hang out.
I'm going to have to put on my thinking cap. I know some people that deal with water witching and wells, so I'll have to put on my thinking cap.
Thinking cap.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's your timeline on that? When do you expect that to be ready for folks?
It's, you know, it's honestly, with the water situation, that's the one thing that's been holding me back. I've been working on the project, putting money into the project for about 5 years now. I'm kind of trying to figure out what route I should take, if I wanted to look for investors, if I wanted to try to branch out a little bit more and get funds from other people rather than just going with myself, because I've been funding it entirely out of my own pocket thus far. So in terms of a timeline, you know, with the pyramid standing, I wouldn't say any longer than 2 years, but probably not any sooner than 6 to 9 months. So somewhere within that timeline. But like I said, you know, I mean, even for individuals who don't really care about the pyramid, but they just love the outdoors, and even for meditative purposes, it's ready to rock and roll now.
So you can just go up there on your own, or do they have to go through you to go in there?
Usually, yeah, they have to go through me. I put a gate up there because I actually had some equipment stolen from me, unfortunately.
Oh no.
Yeah, so I put a gate up there now. But even if it wasn't for that, then it's you do have to have a 4x4 to get there. You won't get there without a 4x4 vehicle, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a lifted truck. I go up there with these older Suzuki sidekicks. They're just like these little old banger cars. You know, they're just kind of like probably, I don't know, the equivalent of like a Kia Soul or something.
Oh yeah, our son Joe had a Suzuki Sidekick.
Yeah, there you go. You know what they are.
Yep, sure do.
So yeah, that's what I go up there with, and it's plenty enough. You just have to have something that's a little lifted, you know, because of the terrain, because it's a dirt road to go out there for 15 miles. But yeah, you know, I'm always going up there, so it's not an issue.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think that's way awesome.
Yeah.
So are you going to have a library up there with all kinds of Upanishad stuff?
Yeah, well, amongst many other things, yeah, the Upanishads, and a library just of general occult mysticism. You know, I'll have a lot of reprints for people of rare books, because I was actually heavily, not so much now, but heavily into collecting very old literature for the longest time. You know, just, you know, like English history, you know, that was printed in the 17th century, and just, you know, really off-the-wall stuff, but nonetheless very interesting.
I think that's fascinating. And I know you're starting the video library on YouTube. I think you're putting a lot of very insightful things up there for people to watch. They're short. I think people can sit down for less than 10 minutes and get some great insights.
Right, it is. It's kind of like the Cliff's Notes version.
Yeah. Well, but for those of us in this busy world, this crazy world, sometimes 10 minutes is all the time we have.
Exactly, right. Rather than people having to devote 2.5 hours to a documentary or something.
Right. No, I really mean that. Those short little things are great.
They are. Well, one of my favorites was when you go through the origins of the word God. Maybe you can get into that just briefly.
Yeah, when the word God, you know, when you look into etymology, and even like, and this goes back to the Upanishads, which we'll cover next time, hopefully, then it's then, you know, they talk basically God says it means a principle in vogue, basically meaning that within the within the universe today we understand everything is kind of chemical action reaction, but during the times when we see like what a god means, and even that, when you go back to the Bible, then Moses picks one god out of many gods. So it's like, well, obviously there's many gods, there's just not one god. There's one absolute, which means behind all the principles, behind all the certain principle cause and effects of things, and there's one absolute behind it. But otherwise, in terms of functionality, the universe presents us with an X amount of gods, and many gods actually. Some speculate that there's 33, some speculate that there's 333, some say that there's 10,000 of them, some say it's a that's in itself is a subject. But the word God, when you look it up in terms of like even the Oxford Dictionary, the etymology, where does that word come from? It just means a principle invoked, meaning that, through the meditative or prayer process that you actually become in tune with a specific principle out of a vast amount of principles, that these principles would grant you certain things. And that's even goes back to astrology, that the principle of Jupiter is the principle of favorability, propitiousness, of money, of expansion, of luck. The principle of Saturn would be, the principle of wisdom, intelligence, discipline, restriction, and the principle of Mars is passion, fighting, anger, or even, anything like that. The principle of Venus would be, lust, sex, beauty, women, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, just, there's many, many gods. There's not just one God, So, yeah, that's an interesting subject in itself, which I did a little, I guess, little 10-minute Cliff's Notes on YouTube entitled, was it Curious Consciousness? I think it's just called God, I think, right?
I think so.
Yeah, the last one I just saw was on aliens.
Oh, yeah.
That was a good one, too, and we don't even have time for that. We're gonna have to talk. I think you have a lot of subject matter that would be good for our listeners that they would love to follow up on.
Yeah, we could definitely do another one again if you guys want.
Yeah, most definitely. Especially now that we're figuring out the technology that all of us can communicate on. I think, okay, so just on the one final thing with the Upanishads, because I know some of our listeners are going to want to take some meat home. If there was one message above everything else that these texts are trying to relay to us in one or two sentences, what would that be?
The truth is within yourself. Don't look for it out there, and everything is just a matter of perception. There's no good or bad. I would tell people just to educate yourself intellectually and spiritually.
Okay, that's
The truth is not out there, as they say. It's within yourself.
It's subjective, isn't it?
No,
it's your
subjective.
Truth.
It's subjective to a certain degree, but that's what that's one of the things that are an interesting aspect about spirituality, is a lot of it is mind-based, subjective, of course, but then you start surpassing it, because what happens is the spiritual practice becomes truly spiritual in that respect, and it's no longer about theory. And that's kind of what I was even saying a little bit beforehand. That to describe even the creation process as the Upanishads describe it, it's almost an intuitive abstraction. It's not so much that the words can even understand your imagination, because it's not a mind-based thing. Like if I was to ask you, Vivian, can you explain to me what intuition is? Then you would say, oh, it's when, you might say something like, oh, it's when, you just understand something. Okay, but what does that mean? And obviously somebody who's never experienced intuition firsthand on several occasions really doesn't know what that means.
Right.
And that's that process which, spirituality even, starts delving into, where you have some of these easier aphorisms, as you were, that don't really mean much to anybody who hasn't experienced it, even like seek and you shall find. It's like, well, that sounds very novel, but unless you've been through a process in your life where you've, really wanted something and then you found it through just a series of apparently unrelated events, then you're like, wow, there really is something to the universe, and the fact that my mind's connected to everything, and somehow, God or my intuition or my subconscious led me this way. And so, is it subjective? Yes, but at the same token, everything in the world is subjective, But then there's things that are just far beyond subjective, which is truly the spiritual pursuit, which the individual through certain protracted efforts via meditation will have to just come to their own conclusion. It's not easy, but I think it's the only thing truly worthwhile in this world, because even money, even all that stuff, it has a certain limitation. It's fun for a while, but then it loses its luster. And, I think even these types of things, like when people try to be famous, or they try to go for money, or they try certain successes, or they want families, that's really just a physical expression and externalization of something you're trying to seek within yourself.
Right.
And so that's why, the meditative process kind of goes beyond, it tries to bypass the physical and just say, why don't you try to experience it within the heart, not the physical heart. We're talking about something completely different here.
The spiritual heart?
The spiritual heart, exactly. Why don't you try to experience it within and try to, try to figure out why it is you're trying to do what you're trying to do. It gets, we'll try to dabble in that a little bit more when we get into the Upanishads, because that starts getting a little bit more into that subject. And it really, true spirituality, it's simply, there's, words can only describe so much. They have, when you start getting into things like these types of abstractions and meditations, and when we start even getting into like psychic phenomenon with the electromagnetic force and higher spiritual realms, words almost don't do anything. They're basically, we're just putting, we're just trying to describe the indescribable, essentially. And so
or it has to be more of an experience.
Exactly. It has to be an experience, and that's it, and the individual just has to, have faith, hope, and do their meditative sessions, and then, according to the efforts that they put into that, then, as they say, that God gives you boons,
Very interesting. When you were talking about the electromagnetic fields, that's going to be something for a whole nother show as well.
Yeah.
Because what crossed my mind as you were talking about building this pyramid center and the pyramid there, are you familiar with the Coral Castle?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Well, that's something about using the electromagnetic fields.
Right.
And understanding that, you'd have that pyramid done overnight.
Oh yeah, exactly. And he must have known something. That's a very interesting story in itself. He
did know something.
Yeah, and he even said that he knew the secrets of the ancient pharaohs, and he was just absolutely reluctant to disclose it to anybody. He just said that the human race is simply too young to know certain types of powers, and I tend to agree with him entirely. If I knew certain powers, I wouldn't give it to people, because the human race, I mean, if we had to base it on credit alone, then there's savage animals, to say the least.
Look what they've done with the internet already.
Right. Well, the internet, that's a completely different discussion. But the internet, the entire basis of the internet was to be, I think, was to introduce people into a virtual, technological-based society, because that was a Department of Defense operation since the 1940s, all the way. Right. So the internet, again, one of those things they pawn off as a convenience, and then they restrict it and control it through, like credit cards, whatever.
Well, clearly we have a lot more to talk about. So, Joe, you've got to come back. We're out of time for this week's show. We're so grateful for your time today, and we'll announce to our listeners when you're coming back.
Sounds good.
Yes, because we do need more time together. We want to remind everybody to go to thepyramidcenter.org.
Yep.
And check it out. You can go to YouTube and Google lots of Joe's things, his shows, his
presentations.
His presentations. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, guys.
We appreciate it. You have a great weekend.
All right. Same to you.
Thanks.